Hello, this is Miss Yetter today, and we are reading Chapter 2 of Hollow City, the second novel in Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. So if you'll open your books to Chapter 2 on page 29, and we will start. Our twin hulls ground to a halt in the rocky shallows. We hove up onto shore just as the sun was dimming behind acres of gray clouds, perhaps an hour left until full dark. The beach was a stony spit clogged with low-tide sea wrack, but it was beautiful to me, more beautiful than any champagne-white tourist beach back home. It meant we had made it. What it meant to the others I could hardly imagine. Most of them hadn't been off Carnaholm in a lifetime, and now they gazed around in wonder, bewildered to still be alive and wondering what on earth to do about it. We staggered from one boat with legs made of rubber. Fiona scooped a handful of slimy pebbles into her mouth and rolled them over her tongue, as if she needed all 5 senses to convince herself she wasn't dreaming, which was just how I'd felt about being in Miss Peregrine's loop at first. I had never in all my life so distrusted my own eyes. Brawin groaned and sank to the ground, exhausted beyond words. She was surrounded and fussed over and showered with thanks for all she'd done. But it was awkward. Our debt was too great, and the words thank you too small. And she tried to wave us away, but was so tired she could barely raise her hand. Meanwhile, Emma and the boys reeled Olive down from the clouds. "You're positively blue," Emma exclaimed when Olive appeared through the fog, and she leapt up to pull the little girl into her arms. Olive was soaked and frozen, her teeth chattering. There were no blankets, nor even a stitch of dry clothing to give her, so Emma ran her ever-hot hands over Olive's body until the worst of her shudders subsided, then sent Fiona and Horace away to gather driftwood for a fire. While waiting for their return, we gathered around the boats to take stock of all we'd lost at sea. It was a grim tally. Nearly everything we'd brought now littered the seafloor. What we had left were the clothes on our backs, a small amount of food in a rusty tin, and Browen's tank-sized steamer trunk. Indestructible and apparently unsinkable, and so absurdly heavy that only Bronwyn herself could ever hope to carry it. We tore open its metal latches, eager to find something useful, or better yet, edible. But all it held was a 3-volume collection of stories called Tales of the Peculiar, the pages spongy with seawater, and a fancy bath mat embroidered with the letters ALP, Miss Peregrine's initials. "Oh, thank heavens, someone remembered the bath mat," Enoch deadpanned. "We're saved." Everything else was gone, including both our maps, the small one Emma had used to navigate us across the channel, and the massive leather-bound loop atlas that had been Mildred's prized possession, the Map of Days. When Mildred realized it was gone, he began to hyperventilate. That was one of the only 5 extant copies, he moaned. It was of incalculable value. Not to mention it contained years of my personal notes and annotations. "At least we still have the Tales of the Peculiar," said Claire, wringing seawater from her blonde curls. "I can't get to sleep at night without hearing one." "What good are fairy tales if we can't even find our way?" Mildred asked. I wondered, find our way to where? It occurred to me that, in our rush to escape the island, I had only ever heard the children talk about reaching the mainland, but we'd never discussed what to do once we got there. As if the idea of actually surviving the journey in those tiny boats was so far fetched, so comically optimistic, that planning for it was a waste of time. I looked at Emma for reassurance, as I often did. She gazed darkly down the beach. The stony sand backed up to low dunes swaying with sawgrass. Beyond was forest, an impenetrable looking barrier of green that continued in both directions as far as I could see. Emma, with her now lost map, had been aiming for a certain port town, but after the storm hit, just making it to dry land had become our goal. There was no telling how far we'd strayed off course. There were no roads I could see, or signposts, or even footpaths, only wilderness. Of course, we didn't really need a map or a signpost or anything else. We needed Miss Peregrine, a whole-heeled one, the Miss Peregrine who would know just where to go and how to get there safely. The one perched before us now, fanning her feathers dry on a boulder, was as broken as her maimed wing, which hooked downward in an alarming V. I could tell it pained the children to see her like this. She was supposed to be their mother, their protector. She'd been queen of their little island world, but now she couldn't speak, couldn't loop time, couldn't even fly. They saw her and winced and looked away. Miss Peregrine kept her eyes trained on the slate-gray sea. They were hard and black and contained unutterable sorrow. They seemed to say, "I failed you." Horace and Fiona arched toward us through the rocky sand, the wind poofing Fiona's wild hair like a storm cloud, Horace bouncing with his hands pressed against the sides of his top hat to keep it secure on his head. Somehow he had kept hold of it throughout our near disaster at sea, but now it was stove in one side like a bent muffler pipe. Still, he refused to let it go. It was the only thing he said that matched his muddy, sopping, finely tailored suit. Their arms were empty. "There's no wood anywhere," Horace said as they reached us. "Did you look in the woods?" said Emma, pointing at the dark line of trees behind the dunes. "Too scary," Horace replied. "We heard an owl." "Since when are you afraid of birds?" Horace shuddered and looked at the sand. Then Fiona elbowed him, and he seemed to remember himself and said, "We found something else, though." "Shelter." "Shelter?" asked Emma. "A road?" asked Mildred. "A goose to cook for supper?" asked Claire. "No," Horace replied. "Balloons." There was a brief, puzzled silence. "What do you mean, balloons?" said Emma. "Big ones in the sky with men inside." Emma's face darkened. "Show us." We followed them back the way they'd come, curving around a bend in the beach and climbing a small embankment. I wondered how we could have possibly missed something as obvious as hot air balloons until we crested a hill and saw them. Not the big, colorful, teardrop-shaped things you see in wall calendars and motivational posters. The sky's the limit. But a pair of miniature zeppelins, black egg-shaped sacks of gas with skeletal cages hung below them, each containing a single pilot. The craft was small and flew low, banking back and forth in lazy zigzags, and the noise of the surf had covered the subtle whine of their propellers. Emma herded us into the tall sawgrass, and we dropped down out of sight. They're submarine hunters, Enoch said, answering the question before anyone had asked it. Mildred might have been the authority when it came to maps and books, but Enoch was an expert in all things military. The best way to spot enemy subs is from the sky, he explained. Then why are they flying so close to the ground? I asked. And why aren't they farther out to sea? That I don't know. Do you think they could be looking for us? Horace ventured. If you mean, could they be whites? Said Hugh. Don't be daft. The whites are with the Germans. They're on the German sub. The whites are allied with whomever it suits their interest to be allied with, Mildred said. There's no reason to think they haven't infiltrated organizations on both sides of the war. I couldn't take my eyes off the strange contraptions in the sky. They looked unnatural, like mechanical insects bloated with tumorous eggs. I don't like the way they're flying, Enoch said, calculating behind his sharp eyes. They're searching the coastline, not the sea. Searching for what? Asked Brownon, but the answer was obvious and frightening, and no one wanted to say it out loud. They were searching for us. We were all squeezed together in the grass, and I felt Emma's body tense next to mine. Run when I say run, she hissed. We'll hide the boats, then ourselves. We waited for the balloons to zag away, then tumbled out of the grass, praying we were too far away to be spotted. As we ran, I found myself wishing that the fog which had plagued us at sea would return again to hide us. It occurred to me that it had very likely saved us once already. Without the fog, those balloons would have spotted us hours ago in our boats when we'd had nowhere to run. And in that way, it was one last thing that the island had done to save its peculiar children. We dragged our boats across the beach toward the sea cave, its entrance a black fissure in a hill of rocks. Rowan had spent her strength completely and could hardly manage to carry herself, much less the boats. So the rest of us struggled to pick up the slack, groaning and straining against holes that kept trying to bury their noses in the wet sand. Halfway across the beach, Miss Peregrine let out a warning cry, and the two Zeppelins bobbed up over the dunes and into our line of sight. We broke into an adrenaline-fueled sprint, flying those boats into the cave like they were on rails, while Miss Peregrine hopped lamely alongside us, her broken wing dragging in the sand. When we were finally out of sight, we dropped the boats and flopped onto their overturned keels, over-wheezing breaths echoing in the damp and dripping dark. Please, please, let them not have seen us, Emma prayed aloud. Ah, birds, our tracks, Mildred yelled, and then he stripped off the overcoat he'd been wearing and scrambled back outside to cover the dark marks our boats had made. From the sky, they'd look like arrows pointing right to our hiding place. We could only watch his footsteps trail away. If anyone but Mildred had ventured out, they'd have been seen for sure. A minute later, he came back, shivering, caked in sand. A red stain outlined his chest. They're getting close now, he panted. I did the best I could. You're bleeding again, Barwin fretted. Mildred had been grazed by a bullet during our melee at the lighthouse the previous night, and though his recovery so far was remarkable, it was far from complete. What have you done with your wound dressing? I threw it away. It was tied in such a complicated manner that I couldn't remove it quickly. An invisible must always be able to disrobe in an instant, or his power is useless. He's even more useless, you stubborn mule, said Emma. Now hold still and don't bite your tongue. This is going to hurt. She squeezed two fingers in the palm of her opposite hand, concentrated for a moment, and then, when she took them out again, they glowed red hot. Mildred balked. Now then, Emma, I'd rather you didn't. Emma pressed her fingers to his wounded shoulder. Mildred gasped. There was the sound of singeing meat, and a curl of smoke rose up from his skin. In a moment, the bleeding stopped. I'll have a scar, Mildred whined. Yes, and who will see it? He sulked and said nothing. The balloon's engines grew louder, then louder still, amplified by the cave's stone walls. I pictured them hovering above the cave, studying our footprints, preparing their assault. Emma leaned her shoulder into mine. The little ones ran to Brawin and buried their faces in her lap, and she hugged them. Despite our peculiar powers, we felt utterly powerless. It was all we could do to sit hunched and blinking at one another in the pale, half-lit, noses running from the cold, hoping our enemies would pass us by. Finally, the engine's whine began to dwindle, and when we could hear our own voices again, Claire mumbled into Brawin's lap, Tell us a story, Win. I'm scared and I don't like this at all. And I don't think I'd like to hear a story I'd like to hear a story instead. Yes, would you tell one? Oliver pleaded. A story from the tales, please. They're my favorite. The most maternal of the peculiars, Brawin was more like a mother to the young ones than even Miss Peregrine. It was Brawin who tucked them into bed at night, Brawin who read them stories and kissed their foreheads. Her strong arms seemed made to gather them in warm embraces, her broad shoulders to carry them. But this was no time for stories, and she said as much. Why, certainly it is, Enoch said with sing-songy sarcasm. But skip the tales for once and tell us the story of how Miss Peregrine's wards found their way to safety without a map or any food and weren't eaten by Hologast along the way. I'm ever so keen to hear how that story ends. If only Miss Peregrine could tell us, Claire sniffled. She disentangled herself from Brawin and went to the bird, who'd been watching us from her perch on one of the boat's overturned keels. What are we to do, headmistress? Said Claire. Please turn human again. Please wake up. Miss Peregrine cooed and stroked Claire's hair with her wing. Then Olive joined in, her face streaking with tears. We need you, Miss Peregrine. We're lost and in danger and increasingly peckish, and we've got no home anymore, nor any friends but one another, and we need you. Miss Peregrine's black eyes shimmered. She turned away, unreachable. Brawin knelt down behind the girls. She can't turn back right now, sweetheart, but we'll get her fixed up, I promise. But how? Olive demanded. Her question reflected off the stone walls. Each echo asked it again. Emma stood up. I'll tell you how, she said, and all eyes went to her. We'll walk, she said it with such conviction that I got a chill. We'll walk and walk until we come to a town. What if there's no town for 50 kilometers, said Enoch. Then we'll walk for 51 kilometers. But I know we weren't blown that far off course. And if the whites should spot us from the air, said Hugh. They won't. We'll be careful. And if they're waiting for us in the town, said Horace, we'll pretend to be normal. We'll pass. I was never much good at that, Mildred said with a laugh. You won't be seen at all, Mill. You'll be our advanced scout and our secret procurer of necessary items. I am quite a talented thief, he said with a touch of pride. A variable master of the five-fingered arts. And then Enoch muttered sourly, maybe we'll have food in our bellies and a warm place to sleep, but we'll still be out in the open, exposed, vulnerable, loopless. And Miss Peregrine is still... We'll find a loop somehow, said Emma. There are landmarks and signposts for those who know what to look for. And if there aren't, we'll find someone like us, a fellow peculiar who can show us where the nearest loop is. And in that loop, there will be an Yumbran, and that Yumbran will be able to give Miss Peregrine the help she needs. I'd never met anyone with Emma's brash confidence. Everything about her exuded it. The way she carried herself with shoulders thrown back, the hard set of her teeth when she made up her mind about something, the way she ended every sentence with a declarative period, never a question mark. It was infectious and I loved it. And I had to fight a sudden urge to kiss her, right there in front of everyone. Hugh coughed, and bees tumbled out of his mouth to form a question mark that shivered in the air. How can you be so bloody sure, he asked. Because I am, that's all. And she brushed her hands as if that were that. You make a nice rousing speech, said Mildred, and I hate to spoil it, but for all we know, Miss Peregrine is the only Yumbran left uncaptured. Recall what Miss Avocat told us? The whites have been raiding loops and abducting Yabrans for weeks now, which means that even if we could find a loop, there'd be no way of knowing whether it still had its Yumbran or was occupied instead by our enemies. We can't simply go knocking on loop doors and hoping they aren't full of whites, or surrendered by half-starved hollows, Enoch said. We won't have to hope, Emma said, then smiled in my direction. Jacob will tell us. My entire body went cold. Me? You can sense hollows from a distance, can't you? Said Emma. In addition to seeing them? When they're close, it kind of feels like I'm going to puke, I admitted. How close do they have to be? Said Mildred. If it's only a few meters, that still puts us within devouring range. We'd need you to sense them from much farther away. I haven't exactly tested it, I said. This is all so new to me. I'd only ever been exposed to Dr. Golan's Hallow, Malthus, the creature who'd killed my grandfather, then narrowly drowned me in Cornholm's bog. How far away had he been when I'd first felt him stalking me, lurking outside my house in Inglewood? It was impossible to know. Regardless, your talent can be developed, said Mildred. Peculiars are a bit like muscles. The more you exercise them, the bigger they grow. This is madness, Enoch said. Are you all really so desperate that you'd stake everything on him? Why, he's just a boy, a soft-bellied normal who knows next to nothing of our world. He isn't normal, Emma said, grimacing as if this were the direst insult. He's one of us, Stuff and rubbish, yelled Enoch. Just because there's a dash of peculiar blood in his veins doesn't make him my brother, and it certainly doesn't make him my protector. We don't know what he's capable of. He probably wouldn't know the difference between a hollow at 50 meters and gas pains. He killed one of them, didn't he? Said Rowan, stabbing in through the eyes with a pair of sheep shears. Stabbed through the eyes with a pair of sheep shears. When's the last time you heard of a peculiar so young doing anything like that? Not since Abe, Hugh said, and at the mention of his name, a reverent hush fell over the children. I heard he once killed with his bare hands, said Rowan. I heard he killed one with a knitting needle and a length of twine, said Horace. In fact, I dreamt it, so I'm certain he did. Half of those stories are just tall tales, and they get taller with every year that passes, said Enoch. The Abraham Portman I knew never did a single thing to help us. He was a great peculiar, said Rowan. He fought bravely and killed scores of hollows for our cause. And then he ran off and left us to hide in that house like refugees while they gallivanted around America playing hero. You don't know what you're talking about, Emma said, flushed with anger. There was a lot more to it than that. Enoch shrugged. Anyway, that's all beside the point, he said. Whatever you thought of Abe, this boy isn't him. In that moment, I hated Enoch, and yet I couldn't blame him for his doubts about me. How could the others, so sure and seasoned in their abilities, put so much faith in mine, in something I was only beginning to understand and had known I was capable of for only a few days, whose grandson I was seemed irrelevant. I simply didn't know what I was doing. You're right, I'm not my grandfather, I said. I'm just a kid from Florida. I probably got lucky when I killed that hollow. Nonsense, said Emma. You'll be every bit the hollow slayer Abe was one day. One day soon, let's hope, said Hugh. It's your destiny, said Horace, and the way he said it made me think he knew something I didn't. And even if it ain't, said Hugh, clapping his hand on my back, you're all we've got, mate. If that's true, Bird help us all, said Enoch. My head was spinning, the weight of their expectations threatening to crush me. I stood unsteady and moved toward the cave exit. I need some air, I said, pushing past Enoch. Jacob, wait, cried Emma. The balloons. But they were long gone. Let him go, Enoch grumbled. If we're lucky, he'll swim back to America.